In the previous episode, we looked at the Second Punic Wars. We will continue in this second part. Back to the Second Punic Wars with a look at the Truceless War. The Truceless War would involve the mutiny of troops used by the Carthaginians. It would take place in 241 BC and end about 3 to 4 years later. It ended with Carthage's victory when Carthage intervened and brought the revolt down, and also led to some changes in territory. What had started the war? Money, or better stated, it was the result of Carthage failing to pay soldiers who had fought in the First Punic Wars for them. It would see the involvement of individuals like Spendius and Motto. When fighting erupted, the soldiers would be joined by others, particularly Africans who had their own disputes with Carthage. They in turn would add to the collective resources in the fight against Carthage. Carthage, reeling from the defeat from the First Punic War, would be still in a weak state. In the early parts, the conflict would go the way of the rebels. At some point, Hannibal Barca would gain joint command of the army and continue the fight. 237 BC would see the defeat of the rebels. However, Carthage would be stopped from taking back territory which had been occupied by the rebels in Sardinia by the Romans, as they stated such action would equate to war. Hamilcar, who had led the Carthaginian land forces from 247 BC in Sicily, moved to establish a presence in southern and eastern Iberia, which added to the resources of Carthage in several important respects. Added to the resources was the population and wealth that came from such a region. He was father to Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Hannibal Barca. The army that he would build would be constituted of Africans, Iberians, Numidians, and others. The Ebro Treaty would be seen in 226 BC. It identified some of the boundaries that Hasdrubal and Rome would use. The river Ebro would be an important boundary. Rome was not to go further south of it, and Carthage further north. It would be relevant when the issue of Saguntum would arise. Saguntum would be a town found south of Ebro, so that when Rome became affiliated with it, it gave the Carthaginians cause to attack the town. When the Romans complained about the attack on its ally, they would demand that Carthage hand over Hannibal, as they demanded Carthage hand over anyone involved in the attacks. The path for war had been set. 219 BC would see Saguntum placed under siege by Hannibal. 218 BC would see war declared, after envoys had been sent following the issue of Saguntum. The Second Punic War would begin in 218 BC and would find itself ending in 201 BC with Roman victory. At stake would be dominance within the region, and with it, more territory. Other states would also be involved in the fighting, and the wars would occur in different locations and climates. Amongst the areas that would witness some of the conflicts would be Sicily, Greece, Iberia, and others. Starting with the year 219 BC, in the city of Saguntum, which would see the notorious Hannibal capture the city after having laid it to siege. War would be declared soon after in 218 BC by Rome, thus the flames of war would be ignited and the flames would spread widely. 218 BC would see Hannibal, the Carthaginian general and leader, son of Hamilcar, and his troops journey to Cisalpine Gaul. They would pass through several regions, overcoming several challenges. Amongst those challenges were the local inhabitants and a difficult terrain. He would be able to overcome several of the enemies he met on the battlefield, a testament to his acumen in military affairs. He would go on to have many other triumphs like the Battle of Trebia and the Battle of Canny. Cisalpine Gaul, a region with a rich history, is now northern Italy. Later on in history, it would be considered as a constituent of Roman Italy. And in the years after the First Punic Wars, Rome would expand in this region, setting up for conflicts with the local Gaul population as they tried to set up towns. These and other actions would create negative emotions in the local tribes, setting up the context for events that would happen in the Second Punic Wars. The year 218 BC would also see the Battle of Ticinus occur and saw victory for the Carthaginians. It would be fought and see the involvement of Publius Cornelius Scipio, who was one of the consuls in that year. He and his army would come to a conflict with Hannibal and his army. Publius Cornelius Scipio would be the father of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, who would have a prominent role in the Second Punic Wars. The battle would see Scipio organize his army, but in the course of the battle, he would be injured, forcing him to be saved by his son. He and his forces would retreat, his rearguard being captured as they did, and he would wait for reinforcements who would arrive later that year, setting up the Battle of Trebia. Hannibal would stay over in winter. The year would also see the Battle of Trebia, which occurred in December between a Roman army led by Sempronius and Carthage. Tiberius Sempronius Longus was the other consul, and had been able to wrestle Malta from the Carthaginians before he had been redirected by the Roman Senate on hearing of Scipio's defeat at the Battle of Ticinus. Defeat would be convincing in its outcome for the Romans. With Scipio still healing and recovering from his wounds, Sempronius would be tasked with leading the troops. With the victory came an expansion in the troops under Hannibal by thousands, as some Gallic individuals would join them. Many casualties would also be endured. Several troops would be captured. Malta was captured by Rome, as has been mentioned before. The conflict involved would involve Sempronius Longus and Hamilcar, who was the son of Gisco. It was after the Battle of Lilybaeum, which had seen the involvement of the praetor Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and would see the Carthaginian ships routed and several of their ships captured. The year would also see Roman colonies attacked by Gallic tribes in Cisalpine Gaul. They escaped to Messina. Messina would be held to siege at some point in the year, a siege which was implemented by the Gauls. The siege would resist and attempt to break it. The Gauls would, however, eventually retreat from Messina. Battle of Rome Crossing occurs. It ends in victory for the Carthaginians. It saw a conflict between Carthage and Gallic Volcae. What happened during the conflict would be that Hanno, the son of Hamilcar, would be sent with a force to position themselves behind the Gauls so that when Hannibal faced them, they would have to face an attack coming from behind them as well. Setting up of a northeast Iberia lodgment by the Romans. Battle of Sissa also occurs in 218 BC and saw conflict between the Roman army led by Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, older brother of Scipio, and a former consul who had been consul in 221, against Carthaginians led by Hanno. The Carthaginians were very much outnumbered by the Roman forces, and Hasdrubal would not arrive to the aid of Hanno until the clash was well over. The battle was a significant loss for the Carthaginians, losing territory and allowing the Romans ground which they could use as a base, limiting the Carthaginians' options further. 217 BC. Apennines crossed by the Carthaginians, a move which would be unanticipated by the Romans. Flaminius goes after Hannibal's army. Battle of Lake Trasimene occurs. Roman army is defeated. Flaminius dies, and on the Roman side several casualties arise from the conflict. Some individuals would be captured by the Carthaginians as a result, including Latins who were treated better than the Romans. The battle had involved an ambush. Carthaginians moved further, passing through several regions including Umbria, Apulia, and Etruria. 216 BC. Southern Italy is the location that Hannibal and his forces travels to. Battle of Canny occurs, which is significant for several reasons, amongst which are the sizes of the armies involved in the battle. The victories of the preceding years would shift the alliances, with several allies shifting camp. For example, Capua, which had formerly been an ally of Rome, would be one of the cities that would now find itself on the Carthaginian side. The conflict would continue growing in terms of breadth and who was involved, as well as the casualties incurred. Several of the parties in the war would find themselves having to act at odds with their usual behavior. For one, Rome would be pressed to add numbers to the army which was losing men, and forced to recruit soldiers widely and sometimes from unexpected sources. 216 BC. New consuls in the form of Gaius Terentius Varro, who had been preceded by Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Marcus Attilius Regulus, are set in place. Gaius Terentius Varro was the son of a butcher, but would rise in the political world and even play a role in the appointment of Minucius as co-dictator at some point. The other consul of that year would be Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Lucius had been consul before in 219 BC. Both consuls would be present at the Battle of Canny. Seizing of supply depot by Hannibal. Paulus and Varro and their army meet in a conflict with Hannibal and his army. Battle sees several notable individuals, at the end of which Carthage emerges victorious due to a well-worked strategy. Battle is known as the Battle of Canny. Lucius Aemilius Paulus would die in this battle. The Battle of Canny would have massive effects on Rome and would see or result in several changes. Over the period that follows, more cities joined the Carthaginian cause. Some factors would limit the cohesion of Carthage and her allies, however. 215 BC. Lockery defects to Carthage. The defect would aid the Carthaginians, and they would be able to use the city to their benefit. Battle of Dertosa, or Battle of Iberia, would also be fought in 215 BC and would see the Romans emerge the victorious party at its termination. A large contingent of the Carthaginian force, made up of Iberians, would run away from battle, but Hasdrubal would be able to escape. On the other side would be the Romans led by Gnaeus and Publius Cornelius Scipio, who were brothers. The battle would be important in the course of the wars. Hannibal wouldn't be able to receive the reinforcements from his brother. Death of Hiero II, Hieronymus takes over. Hiero had been an ally of Rome. Treaty between Syracuse and Carthage also occurs at some point in time, 214 BC. First Macedonian War between Rome and Macedon. Philip V of Macedon had allied with Hannibal, and fighting Macedon would keep Macedon occupied for the Romans. Battle of Beneventum between the Roman Republic and Carthage would result in Roman victory. It saw Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Hanno involved, and again it would mean Hannibal wouldn't get the reinforcements he was looking for. Rome's army increases as they add several recruits to their numbers. 213 BC. Siege on Syracuse by Rome, which lasts until 212. At the end of it, the Romans would be victorious, but the siege would also see Archimedes dead. The siege would also see Marcus Claudius Marcellus involved. He was proconsul. It would also see the propraetor Appius Claudius Pulcher. The siege also saw several devices used on both sides, like the Sambuca on the Roman side. The Sambuca was a siege engine that would also find itself in use during the siege of Chios. 215 had seen the rise of Hieronymus to the throne. His grandfather had been King Hiero II, an ally of Rome. Himilco and his army are sent to respond. Himilco would be a general in the Carthaginian army, and he would be able to gain some territory for the Carthaginians. Arpi is captured by the Romans. Event sees the involvement of the Roman consul Quintus Fabius Maximus. Prior to the battle, the Romans would have gained territory including Aequi, Compsa, Campoteria, and other territories in a phase of war that had changed from the one before it. Elements within the city, seeing the change in fate for the Romans, would offer to aid them. Thus, the city turned to align itself to Rome. A Numidian king called Syphax, who was the king of a tribe in western Numidia, sides with Rome. Syphax would be relevant again in the future. 212 BC. First Battle of Capua, Hannibal would fight the two consuls and their armies, after which the consuls would divide their armies. After this, the Romans would once again attack Capua in the future. Battle of the Silarus occurs. Hannibal emerges victorious. Battle involves a centurion called Marcus Centenius Panella. Significant forces would be lost by the Romans whilst the Carthaginians lost relatively few troops. It followed the Battle of Capua. The Roman consuls separated their troops going in different directions. Hannibal would chase Claudius, one of the consuls. He'd meet the centurion Marcus Centenius Panella, defeat him, and afterwards his pursuit of Claudius would be abandoned. Hannibal moved east. Battle of Herdonia, Hannibal again victorious. It would see Gnaeus Fulvius Flaccus involved. Several Roman troops would be lost. Year also sees Saguntum fall to Roman commanders. 211 BC. Romans attack, but lose several times throughout the year. Siege on Capua. Capua was an ally to the Carthaginians. The siege remains in place despite attempts by Carthage to break it, including a feigned attack on Rome. At a later date, Capua eventually falls. It would see Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and his troops involved, and it followed several attempts by the Romans to capture the city back after it had defected to the Carthaginians. Sicily reinforced by Carthaginian forces. Battle of Upper Baetis, that's made up of the battles of Castello and of Vallorca. It sees Hasdrubal and Hannibal Barca as well as Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio. At the end of it, Publius and Gnaeus were dead. In the events before the battle, the Roman forces were divided between the brothers as Mago and Hasdrubal would be located apart from one another. Therefore, Gnaeus would attack Hasdrubal Barca, and his brother Publius would move to attack Mago. Prior to the wars as well, Castello had been captured by the Romans. At the Battle of Castello, Publius Scipio would battle Indibilis and his army. Initially things went well for him, but the army of the Iberians was reinforced by an arriving Massinissa, which was further compounded by the arrival of Mago and Hasdrubal Gisco. Publius wouldn't survive. Whilst at the Battle of Illorca, Gnaeus Scipio had lost some of his troops as they were bought off by Hasdrubal Barca. He and his forces would be forced on the defensive by the overwhelming force that was arranged against them. The force was comprised of the forces of Hasdrubal Barca, Mago, and Hasdrubal Gisco. Him and his men would be overcome, leaving him dead like his brother. The Carthaginians would make a decision that they might have come to regret in the future. A decision that regarded what they would do with some of the soldiers that still remained alive after the conflicts. 210 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus comes to Iberia. He is the son of Publius Scipio. He eventually becomes a renowned military genius and continues on to play a substantial role in the Battle of Zama that would come in the future. 209 BC, Battle of New Carthage. It was a battle between a Roman army led by Publius Scipio and a Carthaginian army under Mago. After a day of attacking the Carthaginian city, the Romans would initiate another wave of attacks, which was not in keeping with the usual behavior that surrounded attacks on fortifications. Attacks from three directions would occur: south, east, and the west. When Mago moved men that had been on the north wall, the Romans would take advantage, climbing the walls. They would open the east gate. The Romans would be able to enter, sacking the city as they went. Mago would eventually surrender. Among the extensive plunder would be food, ships, and coins. The city's capture would afford the Romans a greater advantage. Battle of Canusium or Asculum would occur in 209 BC as well. It occurred between Hannibal and Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Both sides of the conflict would emerge from the conflict with massive losses. Hannibal would be able to involve himself in another battle involving the fate of the city of Colonia and battled Roman forces that were near to the city. 208 BC, Battle of Baecula between Hasdrubal and Scipio Africanus. Scipio would emerge victorious from the battle. Prior to the battle, Hasdrubal would move his forces when he heard of the Roman army's approach. The new position would have strong defensive attributes, and when the battle began, Scipio would make a move that would greatly limit the Carthaginians' ability to retreat. He had achieved this by sending forces to certain places and paths. He'd then confront the Carthaginians and eventually attack them on the left and right. Hasdrubal would be able to escape, however, and he did so with some of his troops. 207 BC, the Alps is crossed by Hasdrubal. Battle of the Metaurus, death of Hasdrubal. The Battle of Metaurus would see the consuls Marcus Livius and Gaius Claudius Nero involved. Prior to the battle, Hasdrubal had made considerable progress in his journey to join his brother Hannibal. His journey through the Alps would be different to his brother's years before, as many of the Gauls would join him, instead of offering resistance as they had to his brother. At some point, messengers sent to Hannibal from Hasdrubal would be intercepted by the Romans, and the message they had would come to be in the possession of the Romans. The Romans would thus be forced to counter hastily in order to prevent the brothers from joining forces, which they promptly did. Nero would march a force to meet with that under Marcus Livius. Hasdrubal was now facing an army that was larger than the one he initially thought he would, an army that had grown overnight. This observations he would make from where he was. He would move to retreat, but calamities and poor outcomes would follow his attempt, and he would eventually find himself between a hard place and a rock as he was forced to fight. He would fight until he could no longer fight, dying in the battle. And with his death, his attempt to reinforce and add to Hannibal's numbers wouldn't succeed as he had planned it to, significantly weakening Hannibal's position. Following Hasdrubal's defeat, Bruttium would be where Hannibal's forces would move towards. 206 BC. Battle of Ilipa, which would be significant in the history of Scipio Africanus. Mago and Hasdrubal Gisco would be together at Ilipa, and for days prior to the battle, conflicts would occur between the Carthaginians and the Romans. Scipio would use these battles to convince the Carthaginians of how he wanted to use and arrange his troops, so that on the day when Scipio arranged his troops in a different way, the Carthaginians would be unable to rearrange theirs, as they had already arranged in a way assuming the Roman troops would act as they had before. Their flanks and other parts would eventually be attacked. The battle would have to be delayed by heavy rain. Eventually, Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago would flee, along with some men. Mutiny within the Roman troops, suppressed by Scipio. 205 BC. Mago Barca arrives in Genoa. 204 BC. Several events would occur over this period, amongst which would be the demand by the Carthaginian Senate for the army led by Hannibal to return. 204 BC. Battles of Croton would see battles between the Romans and Carthaginians. Croton was a port which Carthage had retained for years, and it and its surroundings would be a setting for a set of conflicts. The events here had followed several other events like the Battle of the Metaurus River, 203 BC, Battle of Iberia. The battle would occur in the context of a Carthage which was on the back foot amidst growing Roman strength. Mago Barca would be tasked with joining his brother Hannibal. Several forces would be added to him by the Ligurians, and his army would increase with the added troops. Proconsul Cornelius Cethegus and Praetor Quintilius Varus and their forces would go against Mago on the battlefield along with his forces in a battle that would prove to be a back-and-forth affair. It would lead to casualties on both sides, and would also see Mago injured. 202 BC, momentous and war-defining Battle of Zama takes place. It would be seen as an important battle in the Second Punic Wars, with Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus and Hannibal taking center stage in the theater of battle. The Romans would be outnumbered but would still achieve victory against the more numerous Carthaginians. Scipio had been made consul in 205 BC. What would set the scene for the battle? Several things had happened. Hannibal had returned from Italy. A draft treaty had been ratified by the Roman Senate and had been rejected. A battle would eventually ensue that saw fierce conflicts between the Carthaginian and Roman forces, with wave after wave of fighting. Some of the fiercest fighting would occur over the battles, but at their end, the Carthaginians would emerge severely weakened. They would be forced to eventually sign a peace treaty, one that would lead to many concessions of territory and a change in its status. A lot of things would change at the conclusion of these events. Zama would see Hannibal defeated. The terms for peace were numerous, some of them stipulating the way Carthage was to act, determining the reduction in territory and which territory was to be lost. The Third Punic War would start around 149 BC. Thank you for listening to this podcast into the Second Punic Wars. If you enjoyed it, be sure to listen and watch other videos. Also subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you in the next episode.